So, Cecilia Sjöholm, Marcia, Cavalcante Schuback, who have just published this year a book called Through the Eyes of Descartes, Seeing, Thinking, Writing, which is out now in 2024. I just read it. It's an interesting book because I think it challenges most of our preconceptions about Descartes and the founder of Rationalism, the founder of mathematical reason, which he obviously is, but you also highlight a lot of different aspects of Descartes. So I think it's a very welcome shift away from the very cliched image we have of Descartes. But I think one aspect that I'd like to begin to ask both of you that somehow runs through this entire book, which consists of now 8 chapters. They are not co-authored, so you have written individual chapters, which are different in scope, and topic, but still, one thread that runs through the whole book, I think, is the idea of Descartes as a thinker of aesthetics. I mean, normally there has been, such books, but normally you wouldn't think of Descartes and aesthetics. So Descartes is a thinker of aesthetics, but also particularly of a kind of Baroque aesthetics that he claims. So how should one understand the position of Descartes here as an aesthetic thinker and a thinker of the Baroque aesthetic? So let's begin there.
Well, to me it's been quite important since a long time back to actually be able to conceive of aesthetic as something that pre-existed before Kant. Because there's been so much writing on topics that related to aesthetic. What is beauty? What is art? How do we relate to the beautiful and the ugly, and how do we relate to art? And I found Descartes to be an example of somebody who was actually thinking through a relation to the beautiful and the ugly in ways that is not quite compatible with the way in which Kant was later doing it. Although maybe Kant was perhaps a reader of Descartes also in this way and changed the way he was thinking about it. But relating Descartes as a thinker of aesthetic means also relating him to thoughts on emotion. Because I think, to me, the most interesting aspect of aesthetic comes out not in the most quoted text, which has to do, a letter I think, which has to do with taste. But to me it was more interesting to look at the passions of the soul, and Marcia as well, as a work that has perhaps not been analyzed in this context before. Because there it brings out what is our relation to the beautiful, and then he's conceiving that in relation to affects and emotions.
The Baroque.
The Baroque, we could say that not because of the epoch that is being formed, a kind of on the way to the Baroque, but if you understand the Baroque as a space of in-between, that is on contaminations of contacts. We could think in terms a little bit like Deleuze, the fold, but it is really, that was amazing, challenging, was to think the so famous dualism by Descartes between body and soul and imagination and reality and so on, to understand that there is a gray zone in between body and soul. When you say body is not soul, soul is not body, what is this not being? It is a gray space of contamination, very typical for the Baroque. No? I am Brazilian and coming from a really Baroque culture, and this is a kind of cultural understanding of the Baroque as this in-between.
It's an uncommon reading. One would think of Leibniz and the Baroque, as in Deleuze's case. So Descartes would be more like, as Deleuze writes, thinker of straight angles, whereas the curved angle would be Leibniz and Baroque. But you take another path. But we'll come back to that. I'm thinking about, Cecilia, I mentioned here this notion of emotions, and your first chapter is called Visceral Aesthetics. And you speak about the violence of the experience of beauty and the ugly, and how the body is incorporated into this. And of course Descartes was a thinker of the body as well. He wrote several treatises on physiology and all the systems inside the body. So how should one begin to think of a visceral aesthetics?
Well, I think this also has to do with the question of the aspects of the Baroque that is present in Descartes, which also has to do with we were both sort of writing about Descartes actually mapping the body in ways that let us see all the little angles, all the connections, all the sort of spaces that is not visible to the eye. He goes into that, into his conception also of how we conceive of the beautiful, because to him an experience that is of the beautiful or of the ugly is something that relates to what's happening inside the body, and that's what he wants to understand, not just sort of this sort of perception of the beautiful, that's something that we can rest on, that we can conceive as something that's external to us. When we conceive an aesthetic experience to Descartes is something that's taking place as much on the inside as something that has to do with the conception of something that is outside of us. And in that way, I think one can say that it's sort of transgressing the relation between inside and outside. Not in the same way as psychoanalytic thinkers will later do, but in a Baroque way.
In a Baroque way.
Yeah.
In a Baroque way.
I think these issues with aesthetics and are I mean, traditionally a little bit to the side of Descartes scholarship, even though they exist. But then there are two chapters by Marcia which really go to the core of what is also the normal reading of Descartes, the cogito and the res cogitans and all these things. And you have two chapters where you discuss, you say, some aesthetics of thought. So even here the notion of aesthetics comes in, and I mean, there are two chapters, and I thought, I mean, something that you have been talking about earlier in previous books is this notion of the, we said in English, gerund, how do you say in English, the ongoing, I am thinking, je suis pensant, res sum res cogitans, the ongoing. So you want to find something also you call a performative aspect of the Cartesian. Performative aspect. I was a bit surprised by that because I read a long time ago Hintekas quotation. I just couldn't get what he was saying. But you promised me that you would convince me that there is a Hinteka somewhere there.
I don't know if I can convince you about it, but I can try.
Yeah.
But I think that following the thread that Cecilia was talking about, if you, instead of reading the work of Descartes in a kind of chronology, think in terms of development, of contradiction, but just thinking, receiving all the inputs of the work, if you go to the Passions of the Soul, you can read that he says it's not the soul that really put the body in movement, but otherwise it's the body, this internality that puts the soul in movement. That is quite interesting. And he says in the Passions of the Soul, he speaks about the emotions of the soul, not emotions of the body. And this made me think, and also very much inspired by the readings by Paul Valéry, that I think is the poet that most understood the aesthetic of Descartes, to see that there is a kind of philosophical emotion, I would call, in that Descartes is accounting for. And this has to do with this very famous, that is the most famous, one of the most famous sentences or proverbs almost in philosophical history. It's, I think, therefore I am. So I went through this to understand that, so going minutely in the different moments in which this phrase was said, this phrase was not said when we think it was said, and to understand that what is at stake with the I think is rather I am thinking. And this I found textual moments in Descartes. And this is the gerundive dimension. That means that we can reread, for instance, the whole meditations and the different doubts that we have, the sensuous doubt, the rational doubt, the metaphysical doubt, and so on, from this account on this kind of strange temporality and strange spatiality of this I am thinking. While I'm thinking, surprising the act of thinking in its action. And this is the source of an emotion. So this was the point, a very important point in my chapters. And about the performative, Hinteka, he's saying that it's also something that he does not quote Valéry, but you could say, Valéry says, to say I am, who says I am? In which moment you say I am? It's impossible. This is a performance. I'm saying that I'm saying I am. This is a little bit what is the core of Hindegarde's argument. But Benveniste, when he defines the performative, he defines as something unique. So what I try to develop is what the performative has to do with this surprising moment of catching the action in its own action. And this is what is the very summary way, the performative. I don't know if I could convince you.
No, but my objection was perhaps coming more from speech act theory, the way the performative is used, which is a different way, because the performative requires set of conventions that are agreed upon. The referee who blows his whistle. If I blow my whistle at home, no one plays football. I need to be a referee. I need to be in a certain position where there's agreed upon conventions. But it seems to me that the Cartesian performance, if it is a performance, really does not require any kind of context. It is absolutely contextless.
No, because it is really this experience that is very transitive, is very ephemeral, but it is this, how do you say, this thickness of reality that you have when you really catch in a surprise the act in its own action. That's why I think the definition by Benveniste of performative is more closer to Descartes.
I think there was also an expression which to see you're seeing. This is an action of reflexivity, and in some sense it is Merleau-Ponty. In some sense it is not. I was wondering how do you see the seeing, to seeing the seeing?
Yeah, what I could see following Descartes' text is that what is about is in this surprising catching the action in its action, is that Descartes wants to say, not deny the reality of the external world, absolutely not, but he is seeing the seeing. And there are illustrations that I think Cecilia can talk very much about it. His illustrations, or gravure, how do you say in English? Gravures, that he sees a man looking at the eye in the very act of seeing. So it is the perception of perception. It is really the seeing of the seeing. So in this sense, he's different from Merleau-Ponty, because Merleau-Ponty is very entangled with this double-sidedness of the touch of being touched, the chiasma, and very interested in how we are cut by the real, by the external world at the same time that you touch the external world. Now, so this is different. I don't know if it's clear, but in this way.
I think that it's very important, and I think a lot of Cecilia's contributions draw on this, is the presence of illustrations. And there's a chapter which is really one of the perhaps more surprising chapters on Descartes' meteorology, which I knew nothing about, I must say. I mean, the kind of aesthetics of the weather. I mean, the way not only because of the particular object, the weather, but also because of the way illustrations, you talk of them as a kind of pre-conceptual approximations of philosophical thought, and you spend a lot of time looking at illustrations, and normally one wouldn't look at illustrations. Books not in philosophy books, yeah, fine, you leaf over them, but for you illustrations are really crucial. Can you say something about how does he work with these pre-conceptual approximations?
But I think they're not illustrations. I think they're very much part of his philosophy. And I think in the optics, as you mentioned, which is also part of his essays on philosophy, as they're called, which he published together with Discours de la Méthode. One is often thinking about that as sort of two very different kinds of philosophizing, because in Discours de la Méthode is trying to aim for a certain knowledge, a sort of foundation for science, which is absolutely rational. But then when you go to the essays, he's actually using images in order to form certain hypotheses of certain forms of consistencies in the world. Like, for instance, what does snow look like? What does the wind look like? but also what does reflection look
Yes.
like? So I think in that sense it's very much entangled also, like Marcia was saying, with questions that are metaphysical, not just sort of the natural sciences or something that only belongs to the physical world. So he's using images to think, and thinking for him is very much a reflective practice, a reflective process that perhaps even requires images. But I think it's interesting that this is something that has been quite forgotten today. I mean, that we can think in and through images. I think one philosopher today that has tried to use it in the contemporary context is Catherine Malabou. She sort of returned to that as a kind of method for thinking, and I think it's very interesting to also to ponder what could we do with it today, not just look at the illustrations of Descartes as something that was sort of ancient, so to speak.
I mean, I must confess myself, normally you read the Discourse on Method and you skip the rest. I mean, what's the meteors, the geometry and the optics, you just basically, they're not often not even published together. You just have the school and method, and then you have to look at the complete to find the rest. So I think it's very common that readers skip over those parts, and I think you show beautifully that they are in fact implicated in very much in the fabric of the school and method itself. Yeah, sure. But I mean, there's a chapter here which addresses, which is connected. Descartes as a writer. I mean, he's also someone who invents. Maybe he uses illustrations or images or whatever, figures in different sense, and but he also reflects, or perhaps not reflects, but he changes the form of writing. He writes in French, which is original, not always, but sometimes, and he as you say, Marcia, he objects the old form of philosophical debates, and he surely he inherits much from medieval thought and scholasticism, but it transforms the act of writing. And of course we have the Discourse and Method and also Paul's Meditations, his autobiographical movement, and so he's also a philosopher of writing, he's also a discourse on writing.
Absolutely. We always forget that in the same Europe, in some few years, three very important persons in relation to the foundation of a new prosa, of a new language of prosa, were living together, namely Shakespeare, Miguel de Cervantes, and Descartes. We could say they are three grounders of the modern English, French, and Spanish prosa. But Descartes is quite interesting because he is the very physicality of the way he thought and wrote. He was lying in the bed like Proust. He was a lying in the bed writer or philosopher, thinker. And he is in this caught by the surprise of the act of thinking while thinking, that this is like a drawing. The English language is quite good for that. It's that to think, the thinking, the movement of thought is like the drawer who draws the drawing. So this wildness is like the drawing. So Descartes was very sensible for the drawing. And that's interesting because Merleau-Ponty is criticizing him. He's so blind because he likes drawing and not the painting. But this is the point. Thanks God that he didn't like the painting, but he liked the drawing, I would say. So he is really a thinker who thinks as a writer writes, and discovers or shows for us that thinking is a way of writing, or writing is a way of thinking. Better, I would say better in this way. Writing is a way of thinking, and Descartes is the embodiment of that, or maybe the first one that showed that. It was very important for him.
So I mean, he uses images, illustrations, figures. He uses writing, and so there's a certain sense in which is, I would say, I would always associate that with Leibniz, but you convinced me that maybe already Descartes, that thought has to be externalized in a certain way. It moves through an external object, like a piece of paper that I have, or a book, or a table, or an illustration. It doesn't really just simply occur inside somewhere, but it's also out there all the time. And writing would, of course, one particular part of that way externalized.
That's very important, if I might say. Jean-Luc Nancy was very, very attentive to that, because Descartes has a passage in which he's talking about the pen. And he's seeing the pen in the paper, and he's seeing that in the upper part of the pen is also drawing in the air. So at the same time that you're having a kind of cartography, you have a aerography happening at the same time. So the hand is really this. So I would say that if you pay attention to that, maybe I suggest we could understand the distinction between body and soul, rather the distinction between thinking and writing. So through this hand that has this upper part and the bottom part and the paper. So something in this direction.
But then I would have to add also that also in using the pen, the hand, etc., as you were saying, it's also related to drawing, which means that drawing is also a way of thinking and creating hypotheses of the way in which the universe is set up. There was a debate between Hobbes and Descartes: is the universe full or does it have gaps in it? And Descartes' way of drawing his hypothesis of what snow looks like, wind, etc., was a way of conceiving a certain sort of ontology of nature.
Because to write is to draw, of course. Of course.
Even though, sure, we need the externality of thought in order to think, but there are also things happening inside, as we know. And these are the chapters 6 and 7 by Cecilia, who draw on the idea of the fetus in Descartes, and how we should understand thought that is not yet shaped by language or concepts in the philosophical sense, but occurs inside the body, the fetus. And you connect that to the voice as well. I find that very... Is that in Descartes? Is that your invention, the voice? I felt it was your invention.
There's a lot of... I think the voice has to do with the performative aspect, as Marcia was mentioning, and this return to the self that can sort of hear itself thinking, not just think itself thinking, but the voice is also a sort of internal sound. But with regards to the fetus, I very much love that correspondence between Descartes and the theologian on the question if the fetus is thinking. because it's not altogether serious. That's what I like. I mean, Descartes is actually joking about it, saying when the theologian is being so serious, of course the fetus is thinking because it's created by God, etc. It already has a human mind into it. It's the argument. And then to Descartes, yes, the fetus is thinking, but it's not thinking like a philosopher. It's not a full-blown metaphysician. And of course this is a joke. But as one reads about this, one can also relate what he's saying to 20th century psychoanalysis. But because what he is showing is that the fetus, and to Descartes it's not clear whether the fetus is actually born or not. I mean, it can be a very small baby, or it can be sort of in the womb of the mother, and the sort of the state, if it's in one state or the other, is sort of fleeting. But the fetus is thinking not as a metaphysician, that it's not somebody is capable of reflecting over his own thought. It's not a cogito, but the thoughts are emotions, and like Marcia said, thoughts can also be embodied to Descartes, and that's an aspect of Descartes that people are not quite aware of.
Yeah, absolutely.
That thought is this very extended notion that can be both sort of metaphysical and emanating from the cogito and embodied, and the child is very much embodied thought.
So there are several passages in all the chapters, in your chapter, Celia, where you say that there are intimations of psychoanalysis in Descartes, and as you say, often this is the Cartesian connection is made through Lacan, but you want to take a different path.
Yeah, I think it more has to do with object relations here, because also in correspondences, I mean, it's very much discussing how emotions are awoken in relation to the maternal body. We're all sort of beings that are given into this world with certain needs. We need to be breasted, we need food, so to speak, and it's through that relation to the maternal breast that emotions of love and hate emanate to Descartes. And these are also among the most prominent passions in Passions of the Soul. Love and hate are sort of fundamental to other kinds of emotion.
So love, the book ends with the Cartesian theory of love, which is also surprising. I knew very little about that, but it's a very interesting ending. And what is a Cartesian love?
Love.
What is it?
Yes.
Le centre aimer, to love each other. There's this thing of the in-between there. Which
Yes, absolutely. It's quite amazing because it has a relation to Sweden somehow, the material related to that, because when the French consul ambassador, Pierre Chanou, he got, before Descartes came to Sweden, he got some transmitted to Descartes 3 questions asked by Queen Christina. And the questions were, what is love? Does by natural light, does we necessarily come to have to arrive to love God? And the third question is, what is to prefer when you think about abused or exaggerated, love or hatred? What is more dangerous, or what you should choose? And this is the material we have more precisely. But I think that many things, the letters that Descartes wrote to Elizabeth of Bohemia, I think they were really love letters. And it has to do because love asks not only that we say what is absolute usefulness, I love you when you love, but you write love letters. And then, but he says in a passage, we cannot say I love you to someone that is in an upper position than you. So you say, I admire you, I respect you. So he's all confessing that he's writing love letters to Elizabeth. And he answers these questions posed by Christina. And he has his theory of love, as Cecilia said, is very coherent with the Passions of the Soul, but has to do with warm. So love is the heat of the heart. So really love is how this heat is embodied, not only the body itself physically, but also the soul. And he also uses very shortly, how to say, for the second time in the French language, the verb en s'entraimer with 2 apostrophes. So this is a love in between, of the tension. And that's why I think that maybe the Cartesian dualism between body and soul is rather the love between body and soul.